Hey everyone, it's Naomi Wolf here, CEO of DailyClout, and I'm so excited to be here with Jason Haber, social entrepreneur, real estate investor, and so many hats.
A little bit of everything.
Yeah. It's quite amazing. You've written a book
Yes.
about social entrepreneurship.
Yes, The Business of Good.
Right?
Yep.
And in a nutshell, what's that about?
So The Business of Good is about how business can be a fulcrum for social change and innovation. There's a lot of conversation right now about capitalism and how it's working and how it's not working. In fact, it came up in the State of the Union. There are conversations about socialism somehow in America. So my book talks about what I call capitalism 2.0, which is using the best of capitalism as a tool to bring equality, fairness to greater numbers of society.
Which is, what you have to say about it is very fresh and original, but social entrepreneurship is also an idea that a lot of people may not have heard of, but that is gaining traction.
Well, it finally is, and it's gaining traction over the last 2 years because this government is doing less and less. The problems of the world are getting bigger and bigger. Someone's got to fill the gap. And so that's where social entrepreneurs are coming into the space where government isn't going and the private sector currently won't go. Social entrepreneurs are filling that space.
That's so interesting, and for good and evil. I mean, we at DailyClout have, definitely it sounds really great. And in fact, the Reagan years were full of, government can't do it, so let's let the private sector step in, sometimes to disastrous effects. But you also have some examples in your book of where it actually is win-win.
Right, and that's the goal. The goal is where you're creating a dynamic where you're able to grow a business and at the same time, at no detriment to the business, help make the world a better place and improve a social problem that government has failed to address or the private sector has failed to address.
So Jason, for those of us watching who might be, I'm just going to adjust this a tiny bit, who might be a little bit skeptical that this could, it sounds too good to be true.
Yeah.
What's an example from your book, for example, of, a social entrepreneur who did solve a problem that government wasn't solving and capitalism alone wasn't solving?
Let's look at I'll give you an example of a nonprofit that's doing charity water. 10 years ago, there were 1.2 billion people on this planet, 1 in 8, who lacked access to clean water. It was a problem that exists mostly in the developing world. Over the last 10 years, it's changed a little bit because we've had serious clean water problems here in the United States, particularly in Flint, Michigan, for example, and out in California. But what's happened is over the last 10 years, social entrepreneurs have created local economies, funded not only water well projects, but jobs in those communities. And what's happened? The number of people today without access to clean water has dropped to 660 million.
Wow.
That's an amazing thing. Over 10 years, the problem has been cut in half.
Right.
Now, the challenge, though, is the 600 or so million people without clean water. Now they're the tougher 600 million because they're in even more rural areas. But the whole concept is that you're not just bringing water, which is vital, but you're also infusing jobs into the community. There's opportunity costs of no longer fetching water out of your community and having it in your local community.
Right.
You can now learn a trade. You can now learn a skill. Companies like M-Pesa now, where you have mobile devices that you can transfer money on to and fro,
right.
and now enabling those local economies to have trade in efficient ways. So it's looking at the sort of totality in different communities and how you're able to create growth.
So you would say that both of those, the water companies that help to bring water to people who don't have it, which are private companies, doing what government can't do or won't do for whatever reason, and these low-cost phone networks in developing areas and parts of the developing world are both examples of entrepreneurs doing well and doing good at the same time. That cliche, which I actually love. It's hard to get away from.
I know, but
it
does work.
Right. Yeah. Okay, well, those are two great examples. So the reason I grabbed Jason for
literally just pulling off the street,
okay, is that I saw his name on a building that I'm aware has probably gone through, and it turned out to be true, a landmarking struggle. I live in the West Village of New York City. It's a historic area. Jason's going to tell you about that. And Jason was the person I contacted to find out more about it. And it turns out that Jason is not only an author about social entrepreneurship, but he also has deep knowledge of something that you all know I'm a real nerd about, but for good reason, which is zoning and landmarking. And so I'm going to be asking Jason a bunch of questions on your behalf about something he's so deeply knowledgeable about. In fact, he has a talk coming up on February 25th at the New York Historical Society.
Well, actually, I'm speaking to the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation.
Totally got that wrong.
But close enough. But another good organization. So we're talking about sort of so the planning of the 20th century and the mistakes that were made that we're still living with today, housing, transportation, mass transit, and how government failed in the 20th century, and how we're living with those mistakes today, and in some cases repeating those mistakes, and in some cases how we've learned from those mistakes.
So let's get right into it, because I am aware that in community after community, people are most impacted by zoning.
Yeah.
And also by the kinds of things that you talk about in your talk that you'll be talking about on February 25th, that you're so deeply knowledgeable about, how car culture in the middle of the 20th century, and I'll leave it to you to explain this in just a minute, shaped our world so much. And I bring a lot of emotion to this because I grew up in miraculously beautiful, pedestrian-friendly cities. I was formed by San Francisco, which is one of the great cities in the world, and you literally don't need a car in San Francisco, and it's an entirely walkable urban environment for a lot of reasons. And then I spent some formative years in Jerusalem, which of course is an ancient city, which evolved over the course of many thousands of years. And all of the great cities that you fall in love with are these kind of walkable cities, which we'll get to in just a minute, which Jane Jacobs, this great visionary journalist / activist of the mid-20th century into the 60s and 70s, I believe.
Yeah, even later.
She explained to us that this kind of urbanist landscape where you can walk and see people and communicate, and you're not dependent on a car, it's not about sprawl, that is good for communities, it's good for the environment, it's good for our soul, it's good for the arts and culture, it's good for safety. So now over to you. Please tell us more about how we got into this sprawl mess.
Well, you mentioned Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs did something very interesting about cars. She said in her book, Death and Life of American Cities, that the destructive force of cities is not illegal drugs, it's not war, it's not fire or famine. It's the car.
Wow. That
no force has been more destructive for cities than automobiles. And why is that? Automobiles draw people out, take people away from cities. But in the 20th century, we were building for the car was a symbol of democracy. So the car is freedom. I can go in the car whenever I want. I don't have to go on someone else's set schedule. I don't have to travel with other people. I'm my own person, and I can just go. Sounds great. So the car is democracy, and suddenly mass transportation, or this sort of Soviet communist attachment to it. That's the first thing.
This was the 50s?
Yes, the 50s.
Right. And wasn't there a targeted effort by the car companies to dissuade people from using mass transit and actually to rip up train tracks? I know.
Well, what happened was, so the car industry is very much vested in not just automobiles, but roads. Not just roads, but parkways and highways that take people out of the cities.
What's a parkway? How do you define it?
Well, different than parkways, it actually terminates in a park. So, for example, on Long Island, the Meadowbrook Parkway terminates at Jones Beach, which was the first parkway beach, public beach in the country. Built by Robert Moses in the 1920s. The public had never seen anything like this before. A public park for everyone.
Right.
And I'll note, when I say everyone, the parkway was built in a way where the overpasses were purposely low. Why would you build overpasses low? You have empty vistas on Long Island. This is the 1920s. Buses could not get under the overpasses. And in the 1920s, Model Ts were generally owned by white people. So African Americans had no access to the beaches. And if you look at the early photos of Jones Beach, swarm with people. We have great photos which I can show you. They're all white. By design. So you have racism built into our very early infrastructure.
Amazing. Which is why these issues of infrastructure, zoning, how a city is built is
they're all related.
So
we're
important.
Interconnected too, because when you have your planners who have racists, who are racist themselves, let's call it what it is, and they're designing not only your roads, but your housing and your transportation infrastructure, it leads to cataclysmic consequences. And we saw those consequences. The the riots in the 60s and 70s and the urban decay that happened didn't happen by accident.
It was due in part.
It was urban planning. It was how we planned post World War II through the 1960s and 70s. We laid the seeds for our own destruction.
So interesting. You were starting with the 20s, these open vistas and these parkways being built, and Jane Jacobs said the car ruined cities.
Yeah.
Between the 20s and the 50s and the 60s, when the cities flared up, as you just said, in Riots, we'll get to how architecture instigated that and made it worse. Help me understand better how cars ruined cities.
Okay, so first what happens is it's the roads, the highways that are built and where you're building them. So Robert Moses, for example, so Moses was the New York's master builder, as they called him, and he held at one point in time 12 appointed positions at the same time. So
it doesn't sound like a normal
as
city employee.
The head of the head of the city planning commission, he could plan projects, and then as construction coordinator, he could approve them.
Oh wow!
So this is
so much power.
Yeah, too much power. And listen, as the head of the Tri-Borough Bridge Authority, he had his own police force. He had his own flag.
Oh my gosh.
He had his own island, Randall's Island. I mean, he literally created a government within a government. He was accountable to no one. We can get into more on Moses later too. But what happened was Robert Moses had the sole authority to plan projects across the New York area. And he didn't care if the highway was in an empty vista, sort of like the Meadowbrook Parkway on Long Island, or if it was through a dense neighborhood like in the South Bronx. And so the building of roads like the Cross Bronx Expressway, which just devastated the Bronx for 50 years, and they're still just recovering from it now. So it's the roads, where they're built, how they're built. And then on those roads, we're taking people out of the city.
Right.
And we're thinking about cities and roads as communities that we're passing through, and not about who's living in there.
Gotcha.
And so it became more about how quickly can you get from Long Island to New Jersey, cut through Manhattan.
So the perspective is all from the kind of white upper middle class suburban point of view. The highways are what you need to get into the city, do your job, come back home, have a cocktail, and get away from all those other people. That
was thought of the new American way, and the congestion that we had, the traffic that we had would go away if we had efficient highways. But of course, what happens is the more roads you build and the more bridges you build, the more cars come onto those roads. So you don't alleviate traffic.
Right.
Now the car companies knew this. And so they're very supportive of the roads, because more roads means more cars means more roads, you're on this perpetual ladder going on.
So people in city government at first thought that they were building more roads to alleviate congestion, and they didn't know what the car companies knew, that you actually then are generating a demand for more cars, and you're going to have more.
That's right. And they were basically the best thing that could happen to the car industry was the public sector building more roads. It was basically subsidizing the entire automobile industry
with taxpayer money. And then what happened to those? So as a San Francisco native, formative memory is hanging onto that streetcar when it went up and down the hills. You're 9 or 10 or 12, like at that time, kids could take the streetcar or whatever. And it's a 100-year-old or 110-year-old object with tracks that work beautifully, nothing wrong with it. So cities and even suburbs like Elmhurst and all these beautiful, like turn of the last century suburbs used to have train tracks, like Tenleytown and outside of DC, Bethesda, they used to have train tracks going right into the city. It's easy on the environment, people commute easily, there's no parking lots. What happened to that?
Well, that was considered sort of the old way of transportation, along with the train. So the 20th century was going to be the century of the automobile, of the individual, and the past would be left behind, where mass transit didn't really have that kind of a place. And so this shift occurred not only in thinking and building, but also in dollars. So all this money, public taxpayer money, is going towards roads and highways and bridges. At the same time, there's a disinvestment that's taking place in mass transit.
Wow.
That disinvestment lives with us still today. So I call it, that's the original sin. We have, it took you forever to get to my office today because it's all this traffic. You have terrible trouble on the subway. We have switches that are over 100 years old.
Crazy.
The Second Avenue subway took 75 years to build before they finally finished it. People say why? They want to blame the governor, you want to blame the mayor, you want to blame the MTA chair. Sure, but if you go way back, the original sin goes to Robert Moses, because that's when we made this decision. He made the decision and we followed. That this disinvestment was going to occur.
Right.
And that's when the investment came in the roads.
Extraordinary. But it's pretty easy to reverse. I mean, look at BART in San Francisco or the MAC in Oregon. It's not that difficult to put a light rail in out of cities. So why aren't we doing
we should have done that here. I mean, originally, the Long Island Expressway was supposed to have light rail. Robert Moses canceled that. It would have been a game changer. Again, it's a matter of priorities. The budget is a set of priorities in the public sector, as my old professor used to say when I was in grad school. So what's our budget? What are our priorities right now? And there needs to be a shift back to mass transit, both for climate change purposes and efficiency purposes, and a whole host of reasons. We know that the car isn't really democracy. The metaphor has proven to not be right, and we need to get back to what works for cities before it's too late. Absolutely, and I would guess that Detroit or the auto industry, and let's not leave out the fossil fuel industry, which benefits from cars. They have their lobbyists in Albany. Oh, yeah. The state has the federal level. Mass transit really doesn't have powerful lobbyists. No, because our mass transit system is a public sector system, right? So we don't have, remember the subways, what's interesting is, the subways here in New York, people don't realize this, the lines used to compete with one another. Right. So you have the IRT and the other lines, and which line had the best service? And they were private companies. Right. They all were consolidated in 1968 when the MTA was formed. Which sadly, in this case, seems to show that socialism didn't work in this case. No. So right, I know that you're right, because there's a berm of a train track behind my house upstate in Hudson River Valley, and there used to be trains going from New York to Great Barrington, making it so easy to get back and forth without a car to the Hudson River Valley. Right. And now those were ripped up in the 60s and 70s, I believe. And now we're dependent on one antiquated kind of train network in the United States, Amtrak, which is subsidized by the U.S. government. Absolutely. But it's nothing like Europe, where you have little trains going everywhere. No, I mean, we've been talking about a bullet train from D.C. to New York and Boston for how long? The Chinese joke that our idea of the Acela that takes 3 hours to get to New York to D.C., their trains could do it in half that time. That's right, without all the gum stuff. Right. That's true. So when people talk about the environmental crisis, why aren't we hearing more? I know this is like a giant question, but why aren't we hearing more about mass transit? I mean, pleasant mass transit isn't awful. It's kind of lovely to get on a train. Because we don't have that. People who are grown up over the last 40 years don't have pleasant mass transit experiences. And so you're saying, well, I could just get in my car, listen to Sirius XM radio, and be in my own world. And that's true until your own world is underwater, because the oceans have risen 2 feet. Exactly. And the other thing that I think it's so important to bring into this discussion, which no one talks about, even environmental groups, which is crazy, is parking lots are not a trivial thing. Again, yes, I'm a big nerd. You too, I'm glad to say, are a big nerd about this, because we need big nerds to solve this crisis and explain this to people. Parking lots, right? You go to the mall, there's zoning now right outside of cities everywhere, and even inside of cities now, ruining cities, for gigantic parking lots for every business. Right. So parking lots also create flooding, because the water can't be absorbed into the earth, and they also disrupt, and this is something I want to ask you about, that streetscape that Jane Jacobs said we all need. I'm looking at it right outside your beautiful office, which is a sidewalk where people can walk, they can go out and get a quart of milk. At the end of the day, they don't have to get into their cars, and also they can communicate with each other, they can create civic life, all of those things sidewalks do. So when I travel, I notice, this is a long rant, but I'm almost done, that often I'm in my hotel room and I can't walk anywhere. Right. If I don't have a car, I can't just take an evening walk. Here's what I want. If you're watching, what I'd like you to do is just Google 1939 Futurama. So in 1939, before there was Disney World, at the World's Fair, people lined up to see an exhibit for the City of Tomorrow. And it was called Futurama. And when you got into this exhibit, the exhibit was underneath you, and you sat in almost like Disney chairs going around, and they were showing what the City of Tomorrow was going to be. Here's what the City of Tomorrow was. It was giant streets, 8 16-lane highways running through cities.
Oh, wow.
Very, very tall buildings.
Wow.
That were set back on basically empty plazas.
Right.
And if you look at the city of the future in 1939, one, there are no people in the model, which is interesting and telling.
Very interesting.
No people on the plazas, empty streets.
Right.
It turned out Futurama was underwritten by the auto industry.
Oh my God.
Back in 1939, they already are seeing their future.
Yes.
With the car and the highway.
Right.
Now, this vision comes to us initially from a Swiss-French architect named Le Corbusier. And Le Corbusier flew over Paris and didn't like all the disorder and thought
that disorder of Paris.
Orderly boulevards were the way to go. And his vision gets somewhat corrupted here in America because we take his vision of these wide vistas and we incorporate also scale. Everything gets bigger in America, in New York especially. We incorporate the super tall building structure into his plan. So we now have, starting before the end of the 1930s, we're already thinking about wide streets, tall buildings, no density, no sense of density, but this idea of order and linear streets. So that's where it starts.
That's called the New International Style?
So, well, yeah, so you can call it that, yes. But if you look at look at the Futurama photos from 1939. Fast forward.
Can I jump in, Jason? As a political analyst, what I'm also seeing and hearing when you describe that, and I've seen those images, and also what I experience in a car-bound American suburb, is a depoliticized population. Mm-hmm. Because if you're not, there's no common space, there's no civic space. Like at the mall, it's a private space, so you can't have a rally, you can't have a protest, you can't, even bump into a neighbor you didn't know was interested in the same thing you're interested in.
James Madison would have liked that, like spreading people out, and he wrote about in Federalist Number 10 how to control factions with him and his political parties. You spread people out as much as you can to limit their interactions. That's exactly what this does. Right.
So go ahead.
So that's where we're at now. Jane Jacobs, who lived...
Can you identify the
Sure. So Jane Jacobs was an author. She was a writer. She lived here, 555 Hudson Street, just up the block from where we're at now. And she wrote for different publications. She was an observer of things around her, and she sees what's happening. There was a plan to put a highway through Washington Square Park. That's when she first gets involved with urban planning fights. She sees there's a plan to rezone the West Village because it's considered a slum.
Right. And the most sought after neighborhoods now for that.
In the entire world. I mean, one of the most beautiful neighborhoods. And so she writes about what she sees with her eyes. All these urban planners are using, blueprints and charts and maps and data. She uses her eyes. And she writes a book based on what she sees out of her apartment, which is low density, retail on the ground floor, walking districts, and where the city becomes a ballet. And everyone has their part, and there are all these intricate roles. But the city also develops eyes. So you know who's going to your butcher shop, to your dry cleaner.
She calls it eyes on the street.
The eyes on the street. And it makes the city a safer place to be. And you contrast that with what the urban planners are doing with large-scale buildings with empty vistas and plazas, which make for dark, empty spaces, which breed crime and are dangerous.
Absolutely. And this brings us, Jason, to what you were starting to say about the riots and warehousing low-income people, right? In these vast, I think that's where
you're right. So what happened basically is you're just throwing low-income people into these very meagerly constructed high-rise buildings that doesn't have retail, that are fenced in many ways. It's almost like a signal, like everyone else stay out. And so it breeds crime. And it breeds all sorts of problems. And then you have the housing being built at the same time. You have the roads bisecting certain communities and cutting people off.
Did they disproportionately go through low-income communities?
Oh, yes. Well, if you look at the South Bronx, is the best example of that. The Cross Bronx Expressway was a thriving middle-class community, but it wasn't built. They didn't have political clout or power. When that was driven through, that was the end for many, many years. Now, Robert Moses tried to do the same thing in Soho. He tried to build the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which would connect the Manhattan Bridge to the Holland Tunnel, which Soho would have just been an 8-lane highway today.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. He tried to do it in Midtown too. At one point, there was a plan to put a highway through the Empire State Building. Imagine the security problems that would cause.
So how did people push back against that?
Well, so here's the thing. In the 1950s, there were not protests in this country. Pre-Vietnam, we didn't have mass protesting of government. And so you had a very early counter-argument to Moses beginning in the 50s in the Bronx, where people began to organize, but this was a very uncomfortable thing. And they were defeated in 1953. The Board of Estimate voted to approve the Cross-Bronx Expressway, even though every elected official said they were against it. Robert Moses controlled them, and that was that. Jane Jacobs begins her work later, late 1950s, early 1960s. The key thing being is there's a cultural change happening, and she catches the wave of. And her protests are much more aggressive. People are getting arrested. No one would be arrested in the 50s for protests.
Different class also.
Yeah, I mean, yes. So different. She's able to get Eleanor Roosevelt involved, which is a very important part for saving Washington Square Park, and so that helps. That helps a lot.
So she basically, Jane Jacobs, the result of this activism, this campaign that she organized and mobilized or was part of, was to save Washington Square as a pedestrian space and also to save a lot of the West Village, right, from being cleaned up.
Yes, a lot of the West Village would have been unrecognizable today. It would have been another large-scale public housing.
So if this model, and other people now who write about this, unfortunately, language isn't great. They call it the new urbanism.
Yeah.
But this model is so important. We need better language for it. I'd like to call it like, the neighborhood model or the living city model or something like that. But it works in suburbs. It's the natural shape of villages in Europe and all over the world, really. And it's just what Jason described, retail on the ground floor, 3 or 4 stories, ideally, of residential. Above that, in Europe, you have, as a woman, because architecture is often gendered, you also have this wonderful thing, which is courtyards.
Right.
So that you can, moms habitually in the middle of the last century would look out the window and watch their kids playing in the courtyard safely, and they would throw down lunches to them. And, there are all these apocryphal stories about, watching kids in enclosed safe space. Or you have in the Netherlands, you have these wonderful enclosed playgrounds at the end of every street, really, in some neighborhoods. And you have also, let's note, along the outer perimeter, often trees are planted so that you're walking in shade, right, on a really hot day. Think of the classic, beautiful neighborhoods of the United States. Most of them were developed in the teens and 20s of the last century, with the streetcars, but also with these beautiful shady walks, that margin along the side with grass and trees. You're not walking alongside a highway or walking in the street. So if that's so good, which it is, and if some developers are starting to move back to it, why are cities now zoned not the way New York is zoned? Why are they not zoned so that Dollar Store has to have a sidewalk in front of it and buys a lot from the city, so that it's developing organically and people can walk to it?
Well, those conversations are happening now. We have a much more transparent process now in New York City. Sort of post Moses, we created something called ULURP for big projects. So the Uniform Land Review process. So it's a 7-month process. If you want any zoning, if you want to do something outside of an existing zoning code, like Hudson Yards is a good example.
Right.
So you have to go through the ULURP process. So it involves the community input at several levels, from community boards, borough presidents, the city council, and the mayor get involved. We can do a whole thing just sort of walking through.
Well, New York is pretty good because the landmass is so restricted. In Manhattan, you kind of can't just throw up your dollar store as a giant parking lot, right? It's restrictively zoned, although I would challenge, I find as a New York City citizen, that the actual regulations and process about how to affect zoning are totally opaque. Yeah. And we could get into that in a follow-up discussion. But even today, I was looking for the landmarking map of Lower Manhattan, and I finally found it. You directed me to it.
It's
but
not easy to find.
For a long time, and it's really
you have to know where to go.
You have to know where to go. And when you look up New York City, the Landmarks Commission, who are these very powerful 6 people who are not elected, you don't know who they are. You can't tweet them. I've been trying to. Seriously, you can't tweet them as individuals. You can't run for a seat on the New York City Landmarks Commission. They have the power to kind of wave their magic wand in a way, even though there's lots of things they need to do, and decide if this giant development goes up along, Hudson or Houston, which anyone wanted, which a lot of residents of the village didn't want, and so on. So can you speak to that?
Well, these battles, some people like to consider it a settled matter that Jane Jacobs was right. Robert Moses was wrong, and we moved on. The truth is nothing that's wrong, and I'll give you the best example of that. We have buildings going up on 57th Street right now in Billionaires Row here in Manhattan, where people spend 20, 30, 50. Someone just spent $238 million on an apartment, which, listen, to me is fine. If people want to spend their money there, it's fine. The problem that I have, the problem is those buildings are casting shadows on Central Park.
That's right.
So who has the power that's allowing that to happen?
I don't know who.
Well, it's
the Landmarks Commission, right?
Right, but we have to ask ourselves, have we really learned the lessons? Have we really adapted if we're building buildings that are casting shadows in Central Park?
See, we aren't. I know that some of the most influential New Yorkers in New York, like Mia Farrow and her husband, filmmaker, who I'm so mad at, I can't even remember his name, Woody Allen, before the fall, they mobilized against some of these gigantic buildings that were going to cast, and now do cast shadows on Central Park. And even they couldn't stop or limit it. Like, the process of stopping it is transparent. I see things going up in the village all the time that are not according to Jane Jacobs' vision and not according to what I believe must be the landmark status of a lot of those blocks. But when I try to find out as a citizen of New York, how do I affect this? How do I put a stop to it? How do I mobilize my neighbors? It's virtually impossible. So how can we in New York, let's start with that, influence or lobby for?
Well, I mean, the good news is that elected officials are more accountable for these decisions. So, for example, while the city planning commission is not an elected position, it's appointed.
Is that different from the Landmarks Preservation Commission, City Planning Commission?
Yes.
Okay.
Two different. So they're appointed by the mayor.
Right.
They're appointed by the borough presidents.
Right.
They're appointed by the controller. So, like, we have, our elected officials have to be accountable to us, but they're only accountable if we speak up. Right?
Yeah, but also, where is this information? My guy, I guess, my borough president chose people on the chose people on this commission that I don't even know where to find them, and I'm really well informed. I mean, as I have a tech company about legislation, where are they? How do I lobby them? How do I make it a
Borough presidents are very important in the planning process.
Tell us about that.
So, they used to be the final decision makers when we used to have the Board of Estimate, which we no longer have, but they appoint members to the community boards and to the borough boards. And they're the ones who first get community input when a big project is coming forward. Mm-hmm. So people should know their local community board meetings. They should go if there's a project in their neighborhood.
Where is that listed?
So on every borough president's website, you can find the community board. Everyone should know.
Can I just say, as someone who owns a tech company, to make legislation clearer, there is no excuse for you, Mr. de Blasio, and your team, because the websites suck so bad. It is so hard to find this information.
They need updating.
But go ahead. I'll try to assemble the borough presidents on DailyClout.
So on the borough presidents pages, you can see where you can find your local community board. And they have applications for members who want to join the community boards too.
But let's take a step back. Where do I find my borough president?
Well, you have an active borough president. Your borough president's Gail Brewer,
right?
And she's pretty good on these issues.
I guess what I mean is, it's kind of a hypothetical question. People watching right now in New York City, would they type "find my borough president"?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, that's a start.
Most people don't know who their borough president.
Okay, so then they find their borough president. Right. So then, if something's going up in the West Village and I want to lobby Gail Brewer, how do I do it?
I would recommend calling the office.
Mm-hmm.
I would recommend
numbers right there.
Numbers there. I'd also speak to your local city council member, because they'll have a vote too in the Mueller process.
And where do I find my local city council member?
I'd say, who is my local city council member in Google or something, because they're not going to be on the same side as the borough president, I believe.
Right.
So then you'll get your city council member.
Right.
In your case downtown, your city council member happens to be the speaker of the city council, which helps. Lori Johnson.
Yes.
Yeah. So getting a coalition together is the best way, as opposed to an individual.
So what Jason is saying is super important, and it always comes down to this. And actually, Jason's been very modest. He worked at the Clinton White House.
Well, I worked for Lanny. I did work for Lanny Davis outside of the White House, but helping. I was an intern helping coordinate in that rough year.
Yes, well, he helped the Clinton White House. Let's put it that way. And at a time when my children's father was also helping at the White House, so we never met, but we
people
were
in common.
witnessing, events and people in common. And it always gets down to this: mobilizing a coalition. It doesn't have to be gigantic.
No.
You can make a big difference at a local level. If you have 50 neighbors who vote, right? 100 neighbors.
You get 50 people to show up in the Borough President's office. You're going to get a meeting with someone.
That's
people
right.
are going to take note.
And it's really, really important for you to vote in every election.
Yes.
And
even the off. There's no such thing as an off or an off.
So really important what Jason just said. Almost no one votes in congressional elections. And this stuff is public record. They don't know how you voted, but they know that you voted.
That you voted.
So when you call your borough president's office or when you call your city council member's office, they can see if you are an active voter in their constituent.
Called triple prime voters.
Oh, that's very interesting. Tell us more about that.
Triple prime voter that's voted in the last 3 elections.
And that gives you all kinds of power, right? It gives you a voice.
Well, he knows you're if you're a triple prime voter, you should be paying attention to because you vote in every election. And listen, we have an election in New York City on February 26th for our new public advocate.
Who knew?
12 people know about this.
Well, tell us more about that.
Who's going to vote on February 26th, right?
Well, a lot more people now that you told them.
I hope so. So we have, the public advocate, we have a vacancy because Eric Schneiderman, who was our attorney general, resigned in disgrace, and Letitia James has replaced him. She was public advocate. She was just elected as our new attorney general for New York State. So her position's open. So by way of special election, there are like 15 people running or something.
Right.
But it's an open seat, and the special election's in a few weeks from now.
So important, and we'll give you updated information about that race when that time gets closer. But let's go back to how I, as a New York City citizen, can lobby. And of course, anyone watching, we'll bring you information about your city, but this is so, so important because you're not powerless. City government just doesn't want you to know what power you have.
It's true.
We started DailyClout because someone worked on the Hill. I said, how do I tell people to contact their representatives more easily? And he said, they don't want to hear from their representatives. It's really true because you can satisfy a smaller number of people at the table if more people don't know how to get to the table. Yeah. So if something is going up, if you want, better landmarking or better zoning, if you don't want them to put a sewage plant by your house, if you don't want sprawl, if you want zoning where, Dollar Store can't just put a giant parking lot next to you, how do you affect that?
Well, these are all municipal issues, so that would always be your city council member. In our case, we have borough presidents. Outside of New York City, county executives is supposed to be the analogous position. Right. But it's not just about you; it's actually about putting people together. 1 + 1 is really 3. So
really, the best thing is wherever you live to put together as many neighbors agree with you in a district. Right. It's not enough to be like all of New York or all of Boston. Right. It's that particular district that council represents.
Bringing in 10 people is like 100 times more effective than you just going in. So it's like you get 10 times the power.
And what Jason said, I can't say it enough, become a triple prime voter.
Yeah.
And that means vote in every single stupid boring election that you think doesn't matter.
They all do.
It's like social credit in China. It makes you more important. It's like being superhost on Airbnb. I get to customer service faster. Right. If you never vote and you're just, complaining and calling your representative, they really can blow you off. And they're inclined to, because what's the point of listening to you? You're not going to vote.
The only downside, you will get more mail from political candidates because they'll see you voted all the time. So you will get more. I don't know if it's a bad thing, but just so you know.
But that's the price you pay. And again, if you assemble even 100 names and a committee of 15 people, and you book an appointment with the chief of staff of your city council member, or your county official, county executive, and it's about zoning, and you name your group something, right? Isn't that helpful?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, West Village, zoning nerds.
But also, get them on social. Social media is great for organizing too, right? Like go after them on social media. Tweet to your elected official. Hey, what about this? Hey, what about this?
That's right. Yeah. And it's so important, just chiming in to say how right Jason is. It's so important for you to embed the regulation or the zoning proposal or the zoning map in your tweet. And again, Bill Kim makes this possible at a state and federal level with legislation. We're not yet there with municipal regulations. That's next. But it's so important because then they can't hide. And you don't have to be rude, but you can say, dear X, you're my representative in the city council. I object to this construction of a sewage plant. And so do all of these 100 people who live in my neighborhood. And then we need to create software where people can attach
Yes.
that list of names. And also it's very important for you to be willing to come forward and be public, because, you know, the secret vote is nice, but the more willing you are to go on the record and say, this is my name, this is where I live, and I object to this, the more it counts. Isn't that true?
Oh, absolutely. And that's how democracy works at its best.
Yeah, absolutely. So don't think that by not putting your name out there, you protect your privacy. They know everything about you anyway.
Sure.
And so you actually protect yourself and raise your voice by being willing to put your name out there and say, you know, I'm your constituent. So I know for security reasons, you might not want to put your whole address, but you can, you know, validate that you're a constituent. You can validate that you vote. I like the movement of photographing your vote, you know, photographing your ballot.
I mean, I do that.
You do? That's like, tell me more about that.
You're not supposed to. I always take a picture of it. Just, you know,
we have to change the rules about you're not supposed to. It's your ballot.
I never understood it.
You want
but
with that.
I mean, you're in a privacy, I always do it.
Right. So that's how you lobby for zoning. And so now let's go back to sidewalks and parking lots. What's your dream of New York? Let's talk about the sidewalk.